Good evening. Thank you for coming. And as this is going, I think, all the way to Australia as well, good morning to those in Australia who are watching at 6 o'clock in the morning, I think. My name's Clive Boddy. I've been researching corporate psychopaths for the last 20 years. But I'm not a psychologist. I'm more of a sociologist, if anything, or a management researcher. So what I'm interested in, essentially, is looking at how the existence of psychopaths in corporate settings affects other employees, it affects the organisations for which they purportedly work, and it affects society at large. So looking at female psychopaths in particular wasn't something that I've done until recently. I have a doctoral student in Australia who's looking at female psychopaths, and therefore I started to read more around the subject. And I also re-examined my existing sets of data going back to 2014 and found that I had found a lot more female psychopaths than I should have done if current estimations of their incidence levels in the population were correct. So what I've basically done is gone back through the data and re-examined it to see how many female psychopaths I found. So I use a measure of primary psychopathy, and it breaks down into two different characterizations, if you like. So secondary psychopathy is more of the violent, antisocial, male expression of the personality. Primary psychopathy involves embodying the essential characteristics of the personality without necessarily being overtly violent and antisocial. I'm going to talk about some of the studies that I've done. Basically, over the years, I've published now, I think, just over 50 academic papers on the subject, 7 book chapters, 2 books, and both of my doctorates are on essentially the same subject, which is these people. I'll use this. So for the sake of this presentation, I'll talk a little bit about who psychopaths are and how to identify them, why we think, or the literature thinks, that female psychopaths are undiscovered, unidentified, and why it all matters to us and to society. So one of the reasons why female psychopaths are less identified, I think, is that the characterization, the sort of paradigmatic view of psychopaths in the last century was very much male-dominated, almost psychotic, dangerous, antisocial, almost delusional. And so very, very oriented towards a male description of the personality. And that has coloured. And the reason for this was probably that the original studies into psychopathy and psychopaths were nearly all in prison or forensic settings. So these were not members of the general community. These were prisoners and criminals convicted of serious offences in Canadian and US prisons. And of course, in any type of research, the key essential part of the research is the sample that you choose to research. So the sample of the population determines, to a large degree, the findings that you will get from the study. So if you research among criminals, male criminals, and violent antisocial male criminals, then that's exactly what you'll find. It doesn't mean you can generalize those findings to wider populations, like all adults or females, or people who are not in prison. And that's what, to some extent, I think psychologists tend to forget. Sample is everything. As I said, I don't look at psychopaths as individuals, I look at their effects on other people. But of course, I read the literature on them as individuals. And one of the outstanding features of them as a personality is that they seem to have a characteristic brain pattern in response to emotional processing and emotional stimuli and emotional events, which is different from non-psychopaths. And in a nutshell, they react in an entirely rational way. They don't react emotionally to emotional events. And the areas of their brain that are commonly associated with processing and contextualizing emotions don't activate. And this either underlies their emotional coldness or, at the very least, it strongly correlates with it. So increasingly, psychologists are coming to the conclusion that these people are born like that, although I don't think anyone's actually said that as explicitly as what I have just done. And there are potentially different pathways to psychopathy, which I'll discuss a bit later. Because I don't have access, and researchers don't have access to brain scans very often, and people would generally refuse probably to do them on themselves, I use a measure of psychopathy which is broadly based on the work of a guy called Harvey Cleckley, who produced one of the original books on, it's called The Mask of Sanity, on psychopaths, in a forensic, in his case, forensic sample, not a criminal sample. And he produced a list of 16 characteristics, and I've used a selection of those for my own measure. And nearly everybody who studies psychopathy would say these are the most prototypical characteristics that you could find. And I use this measure in a variety of ways. So you can use it in a quantitative way where there's a scaled response to the items. And if someone gets 75% or more of those items as definitely applying to them, I call them a corporate psychopath or a primary psychopath. If they score mid-range, which is 50 to 75, I call them either dysfunctional managers or highly psychopathic people without being fully psychopathic. So partially psychopathic. And then everyone else falls into the lower halves of the distribution. So I call them non-psychopaths, all relatively straightforward. What they're after is money, power, and control. And this is applicable to both criminal and corporate psychopaths. So they want to get control and power over other people. And the way they express that control and power is either through violent behavior towards you, where they're controlling your body, or they're controlling your career and your life trajectory by controlling your behavior. As we said in the scale, they're totally egotistical. So looking after number one is their primary aim. And they want to obtain power over others. And this is one of the reasons I think they like to get promoted and to advance up the hierarchy of organizations, because as you go up, you get more power over other people, but you also get more money, which they think gives them power. They equate money with power. Their level of materialism, and this is some research we've just done, is out of all bounds compared to the rest of us, totally driven by money, totally driven by materialistic success. So higher values, emotional relationships mean nothing to them. They're not interested. The strategy they use within corporations is basically this one. They charm those above them. If you have no value to them, which is generally people working underneath them, then they quickly show their real personality to you, which is aberrant, bullying, abusive, unfair, unethical, etc. And so the people at the bottom there are the first ones to recognize that something's wrong with these people. They don't necessarily know what it is, but they know it's something serious. With their colleagues, they sort of sort out who's going to be useful to me and who's a potential threat, and then they behave accordingly to those people. They charm their superiors always and everywhere, and with great precision and dedication. And so typically, if you did a 360 evaluation, for example, those at the top, think of them as stars, absolute stars. Those at the bottom, think of them as the devil in a suit, and a terrible person to work with and a ruthless person to work with. They also create chaos and confusion via their behaviour, which is typically abusive and bullying. And this has the effect of putting everyone else in their immediate area into a state of emotional confusion. So they create an emotional maelstrom all around themselves. This enables them to do what they want to do, which is some sort of self-oriented, egotistical activity. And it also has another side effect, which is beneficial for the corporate psychopath, and that is that if anybody is looking from above, is looking down on this emotional maelstrom of chaos and confusion and people crying in the office, the only sensible person, the only rational person, the only person that isn't affected by all of this is the psychopath that created it all in the first place. So that enables them to look like an ideal leader and get promoted through the ranks. The other thing that enables them to get promoted and recognized is the shallow and superficial recruitment and selection criteria that we tend to use these days. I can see people nodding in the audience, and we don't sort out who's really a good leader and who isn't. In the leadership literature, the best leader is what we academics call a transformational leader. So they transform the trajectory not only of the organization they work for, but also for the individuals within that organization. So in a recent, I think this was 2019 or 20 piece of research, I asked those with a psychopathic leader to rate them on these items of psychopathy, and I asked those with a transformational leader to rate them on the same items. So this is telling you two key bits of information. The first bit is that the psychopathic leader looks more charming, more poised, more socially at ease, more friendly than the true transformational leader does. And therefore we think, oh, he interviews really well, and we think he's the guy we should, or the woman in this case, that we should appoint. So, and that's part of that shallow selection process. When you look into them in some of the qualitative studies that we've done, what you find is they don't actually have that MBA from Harvard that they claim they have. They don't actually have these competencies that they claim they do, because they lie about their competencies, they lie about their qualifications, they lie about the good work that other people have done, and they claim it as their own. And this presents a very compelling picture of someone who deserves a leadership position, but they don't. So if you look across all the other items, so they're egocentric, they're cheating, they're untruthful, they're irresponsible. A real transformational leader scores very lowly on all of those, and the psychopathic leader scores very highly on all of those. And that's where the problems start in organizations. This is the same series of questions, but this time using a transformational leadership scale applied to those with a psychopathic leader and those with a transformational leader, and you get the opposite effect. The only part of the scale where the psychopath leader dips into positive territory is in this innovation, stimulating a little bit of innovation. And possibly the answer to that is it's such a massive shock and surprise to suddenly have this psychopathic leader telling you what to do and bullying you, that it stimulates you to think outside the box. Maybe they're thinking, how on earth can we get out of here? Which is what a lot of them think. As this is about female psychopathy, I thought I'd show you this one. This is a recent, it's just a basic scatter plot linking corporate psychopathy on one side and perceptions of gender discrimination on the other. I'm not sure the gender discrimination is because they really don't like the opposite sex. I suspect it's more to do with the divide and conquer techniques that they use within organisational settings. So they try and set people off against each other or against groups. So they'll use weight, they'll use sex, they'll use sexuality, anything to get people to dislike each other. And the aim of that is so that they can get on with their own self-oriented activities, which are not necessarily, in fact, hardly ever, in line with organisational aims and objectives. So their aim is to get rich, and they don't care how they do it. So it's like where the organisation is going is of no concern to them. So coming back to female psychopaths, I've read whatever I can of the literature so far, and there's 3 common themes, and these themes have been the same over the last 30 years. So firstly, there's not enough studies of female psychopaths. Secondly, therefore we don't know enough about them. And thirdly, and this is relevant to today's presentation, we're not sure whether the ways in which we identify psychopaths are suitable for identifying female psychopaths. And this is because they were developed by studying criminal male psychopaths. So the types of overtly antisocial and violent behaviour that male criminals express isn't necessarily what a corporate psychopath would do or what a female psychopath would do. A corporate psychopath wouldn't, for example, be impulsive enough to get into a sports car which had the keys in the ignition and the engine running. He wouldn't get in and drive away with it, whereas a criminal psychopath would, because the corporate psychopath can afford 20 of those cars himself. He doesn't need to steal someone else's. And the reason we don't really know the incidence rates of male and female psychopathy is 2 reasons. One, there's no large random studies of the adult population, and that's what you really, really need to get a proper incidence rate. And 2 is psychologists, because they're concerned with psychopathy at the individual level, they then almost never write about incidence, even when the title of the paper is Incidence of Female Psychopaths. They just don't mention it. Looking at the literature that exists concerning male and female psychopaths, the general consensus, and I've highlighted the key words in yellow, is that female psychopathy is generally more subtly expressed. So it's more relational aggression rather than physical aggression. It's more psychological. It's less public. So a male corporate psychopath will bully you by screaming at your face right in front of loads of other people. A female will take you into a side office and won't scream at you, but the underlying message will be the same. You're worthless, you're not very good at your job, we're thinking of getting rid of you, blah, blah, blah. And so I think this is partly related to gender expectations and partly related to just simple things like the physical strength. The upper body strength of a male is generally higher than a female, and therefore the resources available to you as a controlling, powerful psychopath include physical violence, whereas it doesn't necessarily include that for a female psychopath. So these are the reasons why females aren't as commonly identified. So what I use, or have used so far, is a measure of 3 different measures, actually, of primary psychopathy. And I think because these are comprising of the essential characteristics of the psychopath, and because they are gender neutral, more or less, this is a better way, I would argue, of looking at incidence rates among male and females. So just to explain a bit more about the difference between primary and secondary psychopathy, and this is just the simplistic pathways. As usual, it's an interplay between socialization and biology. So if you, for example, you were from a disadvantaged background and you had abusive parents and nobody showed you any love and nobody cuddled you, and you would tend to develop into a cold and callous and unemotional child, and that might be expressed through violent, antisocial, and ultimately criminal acts, so you'd be classed as a secondary psychopath. If you were born into a more privileged background where you had a good education and your parents could protect you by hiring good lawyers when you got into trouble, you might end up in university copying the good work of other people to get through your degree and then emerging on the other side as a professional of some kind. And that would be, you'd go into the corporate sector. So, and the one in the middle, I've mentioned intelligence. Obviously, if you're highly intelligent, you would quickly work out that it's far more remunerative to go into the corporate sector and steal money from there than it is to go into a bank and hold it up, because the punishments are a lot less. The rate of finding out what you're doing if you're a fraudster is a lot less. And usually, quite often, companies are reluctant to identify fraud within their operations because they don't want other companies and other members of the public to find out that they are not very good at regulating themselves. This is a history of the quantitative studies that I've done so far. The first one was my DBA in Western Australia, and I measured managerial psychopathy, but I forgot to ask the sex of the psychopath they were talking about, so I couldn't get a ratio from there. Since then, I've made sure that I do. So we've basically done studies in the UK and Australia, and also recently in the US as well. So 3 samples last year in Australia, the US, and the UK. And I'll come to the results of that in a minute. So in summary, what we've got from that is evidence from 3 primary measures of psychopathy used 9 times in 5 samples from 3 countries over 14 years. So it's a pretty substantial body of evidence altogether, I think. I've also done a number of qualitative studies of psychopathy. This doesn't give you any feel for incidence rates of males and females, but it does give you a feel for the behaviour of the male or female psychopath, and it's very similar in terms of its effects. The first study was this study of HR. It was mainly HR directors in the UK. There's 2 groups of people who seem to come across the corporate psychopath more than any other group. One of them are HR, because they have to deal with the bullying and abuse and the aftermath of sexual harassment and things like that in the workplace. And the other one are, strangely enough, auditors, because the auditors have to deal with attempted fraud. And so a study coming from Denmark said that 70% of their auditors in their sample had come across corporate psychopaths in the course of their careers, in the course of their audits and investigations. And that was often in association with attempted fraud. A couple of the qualitative research projects I did were longitudinal in nature. So I looked at a charity over, I think it was almost 3 years, or maybe even a bit longer than 3 years. So I had an informant in the charity who was fighting a desperate rearguard action to try and stop the new CEO from destroying the charity from within. And so he was reporting to me we were communicated by email, by face-to-face meetings, by other telephone. And basically, he lost and he left at the end. But by the time he left, every single person in that charity had left, everyone. And the replacements had also started to leave in large numbers. So he was the last of his cohort, last of his generation, as I said, everyone else was starting to leave as well. So the qualitative research is very important to do, I think, because it gives you a real depth of understanding of what these people do. And it's quite often, as I said, quite frightening. So large amounts of bullying and abuse and yelling and arguments, CV fraud, attempted fraud, financial fraud. And for those who threaten to expose that fraud, we've even seen death threats against the people involved. We've also seen cases of bullying that is so extreme that people have collapsed, physically collapsed onto the floor. It's all, as I said, my book's called A Climate of Fear. It's always a fearful environment that they work in. I remember talking to one HR director who was a very seasoned man. He'd worked in HR, I think, his whole life. And he said to me, yeah, I spoke to him 10 years after the event, after him working for a corporate psychopath. And he said, yeah, I still have dreams about it. And I said, do you mean nightmares when you say dreams? And he said, yeah, that's probably a better way of describing it. So it affects people for long periods of time. Had another woman who was describing all these horrible events to me, but she seemed really calm and collected. So I said, you know, your body language and emotional reactions are indicating that it might not have been a psychopath that you were dealing with. And she said, oh, no, I've had 7 years of intense psychotherapy to help me deal with what I went through. And I've finally come to terms with it. So it has a long-lasting emotional effect on people. And then I do qualitative interviews continually because after my talks, for example, someone will come to me and say, can I talk to you in depth about what happened to me? And I say yes. So I've put together this afternoon a few quotes from people about the female psychopathic bosses they've dealt with. Now, I'll go through these. So it's a typical catalogue of how psychopaths control people in organisations. So I was micromanaged, I was ignored, she would show two sides to her personality. So this could easily be written about a male psychopath boss. So two sides. When somebody superior turns up in the environment, all of a sudden they're nice and sweet and gentle. When they go, they're going back to their bullying self. She only smiles in the face of leadership, was one quote. The rest of the time, nasty and vicious. She made life miserable for everyone. She ruthlessly tormented people. Those above her thought she was perfect. Again, this is a typical quote from qualitative research, and it could equally be about a male psychopath as a female psychopath. Satan disguised as an angel. This person thought she was more of a narcissist than a psychopath. But this imagery of evil, of terror, of immense emotional suffering is a constant theme in the qualitative research that I do. Another theme is people suffering from acute stress to the point of post-traumatic stress disorder. So humiliation, bullying, demeaning. People start to question their own value. They may have had perfect career histories until then, and then they start to question because they think it's something that they've done, at least at first. They think it's their fault rather than the psychopaths. So it's a psychologically threatening environment that they find themselves in. So you find tears tears in the workplace. Everyone's afraid, it's very stressful. Common themes again. She can change personality so quickly, especially if someone of authority is around. So they're masters, absolute masters of upward impression management. They neglect those below them in as much as they're not bothering them. But if you challenge them, so in that respect, they're almost laissez-faire managers. But if you get in their way, or you challenge their decisions, or you say, this won't be good for the company, why are we doing it? Then they become tyrants and bullying and abusive. So it's better not to challenge them. They can mimic empathy, but working with them is an absolute nightmare. So this extreme terminology that you get in these studies is common. It destroys your life, and it destroys the organisations they work for as well. Sorry. Another thing I've done is look at case studies from business history mainly, or from events in economic history, like the global financial crisis, or from, I looked at Hermann Göring as well, as a potential political psychopath. He was identified as a psychopath at the Nuremberg war trials in 1946. Hitler was identified as a psychopath in 1933 by a Norwegian psychiatrist called Johann Schaffenberg, I think he was called. And Hess was identified as a psychopath when he flew into Scotland to make some sort of futile peace arrangement with the British. So he was diagnosed by a British psychiatrist, I think it was. So what that means is all three top Nazis in 20th century Germany were psychopathic. And that means there's no constraints on any of their behaviour. And that's why you get such wild and unconscionable events taking place, which we all know about. Now, one interesting about Göring, he was also highly narcissistic. So a bit like recent leaders that we've had on the world stage. And usually when you see comorbidity in a personality, so Hitler, for example, was psychopathic and paranoid, which is a really bad combination to have. Narcissism seems to temper psychopathy because narcissists want to be liked and admired, at least by their group of minority supporters. So they don't want to go completely over the top and be hated. They want some people, at least, to like them. And that was evident, I think, in Göring's career, especially in terms of his leadership of the Luftwaffe. So what you find in these business case studies is a common series of events. Huge redundancies at first as they streamline operations. Even more job losses after the company goes bankrupt, which it quite often does because of the fraud that they're perpetrating. People's pensions are destroyed, especially if they work for the company. Shareholders' investments are decimated. There's an upward migration of wealth, and everyone is worse off apart from the organisational psychopath, who usually walks off with either tens of millions or hundreds of millions, whereas everyone else is severely impoverished, as well as society being impoverished because of the loss of that enterprise. As I said, one of the people I've looked at is Robert Maxwell, and he scores highly on a lot of the behavioural aspects that you'd associate with psychopathy. I don't think there was enough evidence to say he was categorically a psychopath, but certainly had a lot of their traits. He'd hit people on the back of the head who he didn't like, who he employed, for example. He was having an affair with or trying to have an affair with his secretary. He was manipulating people. He's reported to have used physical violence on his children, all that kind of thing. Ghislaine, of course, because there's a genetic element to psychopathy, so tends to run in families to some degree. And because there's a socialization element, she would have got both of those. So I've been reading her biography of hers, biography, and I haven't finished analysing her behaviour yet, but she certainly looks like a promising candidate for a brain scan. Right, going back to ratios, male-female ratios of psychopathy. When I went through the evidence, I found that a lot of the statements are not really based on much evidence. So Kent Keel, for example, it does great work in terms of looking at psychopathic brain and how it reacts. But he came up with this statement in his book that there was the male-female ratio was 10-1. But at that stage, he'd nearly always only looked at criminal male psychopaths. So it's not a sample on which you can make a good statement about the incidence of female psychopaths. What's this? Clark, in his book, claims it was 4-1. And then Coyd, again, claimed it was 4-1, but he was using a measure which had elements of typically male psychopathic behaviour in it. So one of his interesting findings was that the higher the cutoff point you use within that scale to measure psychopathy, the less females there were. But we're not sure, is that because it was a male-oriented scale, or is it because there's less females at the extreme end of psychopathy? And we still don't really know that. So the average estimate seemed to be about 6-1. So what I did is go back through my research where I had information on male-female ratios, and this is what I found. In the first UK sample, using a measure of managerial psychopathy, I got a ratio of 1.2-1. In the other 4 samples, I've used 2 or 3 different measures. So I've used Levenson's self-report psychopathy scale, which is 16 items, and I've used 2 of my measures as well. So that's why we get 9 measures over 5 samples. And as you can see, the ratios are all much higher for female psychopaths than any of those ratios that we looked at in the previous slide. We're getting, on average, about 1.2-1 rather than 4 or 5-1. And this is consistent across 3 countries and multiple measures. So we can say, these are, I should say, my samples are convenience samples, and they're samples of white-collar workers. What we really need is a random sample of the adult population to get a proper measure. But relativities within samples are more reliable and accurate than absolute measures. And so if we're capturing people in the same way, it's fair to say that those ratios of male to female have some validity and reliability to them. Another way of looking at the same ratios or similar ratios is to look at the number of people who are not outright psychopaths, but score at 8 or more, or who endorse 8 or more of the 16 items on Levenson's scale. So when he did it among a sample of, and he works with, I think, Keel and someone else, he found 23% of males were sufficiently psychopathic enough, or endorsed sufficiently numbers of those attributes to be potentially problematic for society. And he found 6% of females had the same thing. So that would imply a ratio of 3.8-1. So we just replicated that finding. And I should say, when I say we, I work with a very clever professor of statistics from Australia called Professor Ross Taplin, and he keeps me on the straight and narrow as far as sampling, and not sampling, but analysis, straight data analysis and statistics are concerned. So we replicated what Levenson did there, and what we found across the three countries we've just looked at, is an average of 28% of males endorsing at least half the items and 19% of women. And that gives a ratio of 1.5 to 1. So it's a different way of measuring the same thing, or a similar thing, but it's, again, we're finding a lot more female psychopaths than we would expect to find if previous studies were accurate. Another way of looking at the same thing is looking at the distribution of scores across males and females. So this is the distribution of scores across male managers, and that is the distribution of scores across female managers. And as you can see, it's almost the same. So most people score very lowly on any psychopathy measure you use, which is what we'd expect, and only a few score in the very high reaches of the personality. So that again indicates that males and females are exhibiting levels of psychopathy which are very similar to each other. We did the same thing using Levenson's scale. So this is at the individual level of psychopathy, and we found more or less the same thing again. So male, female, male, female, male, female. So very low at the bottom end, very high at the bottom end, high levels of non-psychopaths, and a few psychopaths at the top end. So those are the three key indicators that I've used to estimate ratios, or we've used to estimate ratios, I should say. I've also looked in one of my studies at how females react to psychopaths as managers compared to how males react. And it's very similar. People feel, both male and female, and there's no statistical difference between any of these items. You feel agitated, angry, anxious, depressed, discouraged, discontent, ill at ease. Job satisfaction drops through the floor. Wellness, individual wellness goes down. And people start to withdraw from the organisation. Firstly, at a kind of emotional level or semi-physical level. So they'll come in late, they'll leave early, they'll have long lunch breaks, they'll go for coffee, and they'll do whatever they can to avoid working alongside the psychopathic person. So that's their aim, to avoid them. And eventually they usually, as I said, they usually leave. And you get huge amounts of turnover when you have a psychopathic manager. One of the other things that males and females do in reaction to the presence of a psychopathic manager is an amount of retaliation. So they retaliate against the company by small acts of sabotage to, I suppose it's what's it called? Getting their own back on what's happening to them. So they blame the company for having this awful boss put over them by the company. And they, as I say, they react in these ways. So they fail to follow instructions. They slow things down when you need to go fast. They do the work incorrectly, all these things. And as you can see from the two levels of frequency, females do it slightly less than males do it, but these are not statistically significant at a 90% level of confidence. So in other words, it's all more or less the same behaviour, whether it's males or females. I've just got a slide there to remind me to mention that Ross Taplin helps me with this, or works alongside me with this. So basically, that's the end of the stuff on exclusively female psychopaths and how females react to the presence of psychopaths and what the distribution of psychopathy scores is among males and females. And the rest of the presentation, if you want to continue, looks at why this is important to know. So especially in a corporate context. So how do corporate psychopaths impact their colleagues? the organisations and society. One thing to note is that many corporations these days are bigger than nation states in terms of their financial size. And so heading a corporation, as you know, is so well remunerated that it's like winning the lottery. All of a sudden you're getting 3 million a year plus bonus. And therefore it's important to know the characters of the people who ascend to these positions. So these are some of the people I've looked at in the case studies that I've done. So the three at the top are the three senior guys at Enron. All three of them have been identified by people other than me as having psychopathic traits. Bernie Madoff, of course, you'll know from the, it was at the time the biggest fraud in economic history, and so was the Enron fraud at the time. So these people do things in a big way. Robert Maxwell stole, as you know, from his pension fund, and the pensioners ended up with, I think it was in the end half of what they should have got after various court cases. Al Dunlap was probably the nastiest of all of these corporate psychopaths. And I've written papers about him which go through that. So psychopaths want to get to the top because they want power and control. Getting to the top of an organisation gives you that because you have so much authority over other people, and also you have the monetary power to give money or withhold money in terms of salary and bonuses from other people, and they use that to their advantage to get people to do things that they may not otherwise want to do within a corporate setting. At a political level, leadership is even more important. So with this slide, I'm showing the importance of leadership. So it affects the quality of leadership, affects us at a deep and profound and broad level. So are we going to war? Are we going to remain a democracy? Are we going to go to war on flimsy and made-up evidence? How do we treat people who are competitors or political competitors? These things are all very important. And one of my favourite authors on leadership is called Robert Hogan, I think. And he writes very sensible stuff about leadership. And he says it's the most important thing that we study in the social sciences. It's probably as well as being the most important, the least properly funded. I would argue that not only is leadership the most important thing to study, but within that, toxic leadership and psychopathy and psychopathic leadership is even more important because because they're so unexpected and impactful, they create a tsunami of destruction that sweeps through the whole organisation and destroys people's lives and careers and prospects. And it destroys, so somebody did a study, for example, on the relationship between individual psychopathy and the willingness to illegally dump toxic waste material. And for the psychopath, there's no problem with that. You save money, you might poison the earth for future generations or your own children, but they don't care about that. They don't care about the future. They don't care about their own children or their own families. They're quite happy to poison the earth for that. And also, because they have this emotional disconnect within their own brains and within relationships, I've argued in a previous paper that they are the most rational human being there is. So they are the homo economicus that economists talk about in the classical economics literature. They're the only ones who are purely rational because the rest of us have emotional considerations to think about. So somebody did an experiment, and I can't remember who it was, but essentially what they found is the psychopath will always make the rational decision. So if your best friend, just as an example, if your best friend just won the Euro lottery tomorrow and got 103 million euros, I suppose it will be, and they said to you, I'm going to share it with you, here's €5. You might say, oh, it's okay, you can keep your €5 because you'd be insulted that they were giving you a tiny fraction of what they'd just won. Whereas a psychopath would say, oh, thanks very much, because it's €5, it might be nothing, but it's still a gain, it's still a positive movement. So their moral and ethical decision-making is utilitarian in its rationality. So as I said, they create a climate of fear so that people are afraid to confront what they're doing. This next slide is totally out of place, but as I was saying, it's about Homo economicus. So I reckon they are, and I'm not the only one who's written about this. It's becoming a topic of interest in management and economic research. They are the only ones who operate in a perfectly rational way. This, to change subject slightly, this is the comment from an NHS, I think, consultant psychiatrist who said, and he was talking about the bullying that's always evident in healthcare for some reason, and particularly in the NHS. Tackling psychopathy should be a necessary competency in how we train our leaders. So in other words, we've got to learn about these people so we know how to identify them and control them, or try and control them, so that we can get rid of this excessive bullying that we find in organisations. Where they will impact on you differs from, according to where they are in the organisation. So you have down there the existence of a psychopath in one department. So the people in that department might know there's something really odd about this person. The rest of the company might not know what's happening. They'll know that there is some strange, irregular, and inefficient decisions coming out of this department, but they won't know why. So it affects everybody without us knowing it, but we can't identify it at an individual level. As I said, it seems to be around 70% of HR directors and auditors who experience these people. For the rest of us, at any given moment, it's around 5% to 15% of us who are working closely enough with one of these people to recognize their characteristics. As I said, we might not recognize them as a psychopath, but we know they're ruthless and lying and claiming the work of others and bullying and abusing and yelling and sexually harassing people. And I reckon roughly within anyone's lifetime, there's a 30% of us will have worked closely with one of these people. And when I first started presenting this stuff not to invited audiences, but to general audiences of the population who weren't really knowing what I was going to talk about, I'd usually find around 30% of people nodding their heads and agreeing with everything I said, and about 70% looking totally lost and bewildered, and you know, they had the impression that I was talking nonsense because they didn't recognize any of this in their own lives, and therefore they didn't think it was possible for anyone to experience this level of severity of behavior within an organization. In one of my earliest studies, I calculated the amount of bullying that was taking place because I measured it in terms of frequency, and I found 26% of all bullying was due to the presence of corporate psychopaths. So it's a huge amount of bullying. And another 21% is due to the presence of the partially psychopathic. So I redid this was from Australia, I redid it in England and found it was even more, it was 35% of all bullying was associated with the presence of corporate psychopaths. So it's huge amounts of abuse. And the same goes for getting into arguments with others, experiencing yelling, people being rude, and unfair treatment of others. Unfair treatment and little interest in the feelings of subordinates if you've got a psychopathic manager, because they don't care about you. They don't care about anyone but themselves. So they're disinterested in training you, for example. And I think I've got some slides on that further on. Recently, we looked at humour types. And light humour is used as a positive way in organisations. It relieves stress, it helps people get on with each other. But psychopaths use dark humour. They use ridicule, sarcasm as a means of bullying, while pretending to be humorous. And that's what that slide shows. What's this? Abusive supervision again, so use of ridicule and putting people down in front of other people. So in a normal population, only 21% of people experience that, whereas under a psychopathic manager, half of people experience that. So huge increases. I like to use percentages, even though Ross doesn't like that at all, because he wants to do more sophisticated stuff. But using percentages shows the amount of people who are affected by this. Regressions and stuff like that don't show that. And it's only, once you know that half of the people in an organisation have been affected by that, that's a qualitatively different measure than looking at it in a more statistically abstract manner. This is just the information from the graphs that I showed earlier, so showing that charm and poise and rationality are higher among psychopathic leaders than they are among transformational leaders. So that's where the confusion comes in. That's the same. There's a whole series of scatter what they're called, scatter graphs anyway, which link psychopathy on one side with different types of behaviour on the other. So yelling goes through the roof. Communications at work go down because the psychopath isn't interested in communicating with those below them. They're only interested in upward impressing management and pleasing their bosses. So they won't train you, they won't talk to you, they won't tell you what to do. And communications go down. People start to close in upon themselves in this abusive environment because there's a way of protecting themselves. So they communicate less with each other as well. I could use this, couldn't I? This was looking at communications and pathways to poor communications. So we were looking at humour, aggressive humour in particular, conflict, gender discrimination, and fake corporate social responsibility. So fake CSR wasn't actually affecting humour in this sort of statistical pathway, but it was an interesting finder in itself. These people will use the facade of caring about the environment to present a good image, but it's entirely false and fake. Do you have work problems because you lack information? Yes, of course, under psychopaths, because there's no communication, there's no training, there's no telling you what to do and how to do it. Does the organisation show commitment to its employees? No, of course not. Not under corporate psychopaths, because they don't care about their employees. Does other people's incompetence make work harder? Yes, because the psychopath isn't training people or communicating with people. Good people are leaving. You've got no one to learn from if you're new to the company, because all the good people have left, and therefore you don't know what to do. And so people wander around saying, what do we do now? There's a lack of direction. There's a lack of direction and a lack of proper leadership. Do interruptions go up? Yeah, because everyone's asking each other what they think they should do. Does the company work in an environmentally friendly way? No, that's of no interest. As I've already mentioned, the willingness to indulge in toxic waste, illegal toxic waste riddance. Arguments go through the roof. Working to the benefit of the local community goes down. Do you get recognition for doing a good job? No. Corporate ethics goes down. Corporate trustworthiness goes down. One of the reasons trustworthiness goes down is these people get appointed to positions where they can't really do the job because they've claimed qualifications and experience and competencies that they don't really have. And therefore, once they get there, they have to put pressure on those underneath them to do the job that they should be doing. So they're not trustworthy because they're not credible and they're not competent. So those below them can't rely on them to do their job properly. The only thing that goes up, as you saw earlier, was counterproductive work behaviour. What slide am I on? Would you like me to continue or? Yeah, okay. Other things that go up with conflict and bullying, I repeated the same thing in a UK study as I'd done in Australia, and the results were almost identical. I sent them off to the journal where I had the first one published, and I said, well, what's the point of publishing this? It's exactly the same as you found in Australia. So, employee commitment goes down, of course, because why would you be engaged with or committed to an organisation which is letting you down in such a comprehensive manner? I looked at marketing services because I used to be in marketing. So marketing services is the idea that the customer comes first. So obviously that's nonsense as far as the psychopath's concerned, because the psychopath comes first. Marketing idealism, again, is the idea that you're there to serve the customer, which of course they're not interested in. Management credibility, as I said, goes down. Mental health is severely affected by the presence of corporate psychopath managers because they create an environment which is so stressful and abusive. These are the pathways, or some of the pathways, to reduced mental health. So the use of dark humour, people have no control over their career and work trajectory, and they have abusive supervision. Are you all right for me to carry on? Yeah? Okay, I will. The distribution through organisational society seems to be something like this. So you get 1% at the bottom, more or less, and there isn't much evidence to this, but it makes sense, and you get about 3.5% at the top. So the further up you go in an organisation, theoretically, the more corporate psychopaths you find. On top of that, they want money, power, and control. So they go into some types of organisations where those things are available more than others. So if you want money, power, and control, you don't really go into the caring part of the community. You don't become a nurse. You don't become a beautician. You don't become a healthcare worker because these don't come with money and power, or not much anyway. So they become CEOs and lawyers and professionals. And therefore, in some organisations, like corporate banks, for example, you might have a different distribution of leaders, of psychopathic leaders and managers through the organisation. And one of my papers that caused a lot of press comment at the time and discussion in various media at the time was called the Corporate Psychopaths Theory of the Global Financial Crisis. So it was the idea that the psychopaths working in that corporate banking were highly instrumental in engineering the crisis. And as I said a bit earlier, I think, because they're perfectly rational human beings, they would bankrupt the whole world economy for the gain of a single dollar for themselves, because that's the rational thing to do. A finance journalist was talking about this theory with a corporate banker friend of his over a glass of wine and said, do you think there's any credence to this theory? And the banker said, we used a psychopathy measure to recruit people into the bank. Not to keep them out, but to recruit them in, because they wanted highly competitive, aggressive people who they presumably thought would be aggressive against the competition rather than aggressive against the organisation that was hiring them. So if you take that into account, and they were good at recruiting psychopathic people, maybe the distribution in the banking sector is more like that. And there was a USA psychiatrist who works in Wall Street, and he said, yeah, about 10% of my clients are psychopathic. I think I said one of the results of all this is that people leave as quickly as they can. And we've only measured that qualitatively so far, but it's a repeating finding. Another thing we looked at is the attraction, selection, attrition cycle. So people go into an organisation, if they like it, they stay, if they don't like it, they leave. So the only people in another study in the Journal of Business Ethics showed that the only people who can stand being managed by a psychopathic boss are people with high levels of psychopathy themselves, because they're not bothered, they're not emotionally bothered about the abuse and violence that they might be feeling. And we found that. We find the higher the levels, there's a correlation between managerial psychopathy and individual psychopathy within companies. As a result of all this, a risk expert analyst called Marshall said corporate psychopaths are the biggest threat to business ethics globally. The other guy is a philosopher, and he said they're dangerous because they destroy the bonds of trust that we all have with each other because of their behaviour. So the fabric of society starts to disintegrate. So in summary, employees are abused and traumatized, organizations are eviscerated and incapacitated, and society is diminished and impoverished and becomes less sustainable. If you want to know more about it, and you have been bullied, people who watch this talk on corporate psychopaths and bullying report that it is very helpful for them to understand what happened to them. And there's a documentary called The Psychopath Next Door, which I think is out of Canada originally. Don't confuse it with the mini-series from the States, which is also called The Psychopath Next Door, because it's a different type of psychopath. So, again, going back to the ratios issue, it's basically after sorry, some people are making me laugh in the audience. After 81 years of looking at psychopaths since The Mask of Sanity was first published, we still don't actually accurately know how many there are. But I think there are a lot more females than originally estimated. And just to remind you of the evidence I presented, so 3 measures used 9 times among 5 samples over 14 years, we get on average about 1.2 male psychopaths to every female psychopath. And only 10 minutes over, but I will still take questions if anybody.
Hello, I was going to ask why you feel that psychopaths are overly represented in NHS staff when you said also...
Sorry, I don't think that's on. I can't hear you.
So you said that you felt that psychopaths were overly represented in NHS
No,
structures.
I didn't say that, no. I said there are some, typically on the admin side, from the qualitative research that I've done, and they were particularly, it was a female, they were particularly nasty and ruthless, to the extent that I'm not allowed to write what they did in any paper I produce, because it was so, if I do write it, it will be too specific and people will know who it was. So basically they were doing things, at a milder level, they would have a fleet of top-of-the-range Range Rovers for the executive, but they couldn't afford new ambulances for the trust itself. So the priority was looking after the leadership team rather than looking after the medical staff. And the way to identify that, well, there's a few ways. One is looking at the number of gag orders that they've placed on medical staff. So when doctors and nurses complaining about the bullying that's going on, they'll pay them off with a year or 2 years or 3 years salary, but they'll make them sign a non-disclosure agreement and they'll never be able to talk about it. And that's the way that the leaders protect themselves against people knowing what's really happening. So if you did a league table of the most gag orders versus the least gag orders, you'd get an indication of which ones to avoid.
Hello, John Douglas Piper, local artist. I just got a question about the assessment of your participants. It strikes me that the male and female is quite a binary way of assessing at the moment, and that within those groups there's a diverse range of sexual orientation and gender orientation within those. And would some of those on that scale would behave differently? And would you consider assessing your participants in that context in greater detail?
I didn't hear all of them, sorry. We do have a non-binary category, but the amount of people who assign themselves to that is so tiny that the main part of the analysis is male and female. So it's just a practical reason, really. And the other thing is with psychopathy research, because there are, with 1,000 people, you might only get 10 psychopaths to begin with. So the sample size of the highly psychopathic is very small, and therefore you have problems in terms of statistical comparisons and analysis to begin with. So to cut it down even at an even finer level would be highly problematic. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, sorry. Hi. I was wondering about, so when you were talking about contextual stuff right at the beginning in terms of the people who were in prisons being the ones that were predominantly in the studies, and so you can't extrapolate out.
Yep.
And then looking at the brain scans and saying that, okay, this, in terms of the brain scans, this is what's going on with people who are non-psychopathic and people who are psychopathic. Do you then look at that from a contextual point of view? So I was wondering about those brain scans and thinking, what is it that would light up certain areas of the brain? And then does that change? Are there any psychopaths, basically, that you would go, if I put them in this context, those areas of the brain might light up? Like there may be some areas where they're not rational, but they're more magnanimous, or the other areas where you can shift that. I know that's a big question, but that would be my question.
Well, yeah, as I said, that's not really my area of expertise, so I don't look at individual psychopaths and what's going on with them. I look at the impact on society. And I think it's fair to say that most of the brain scans that have been done are with criminal males. So whether that equally applies to females is yet to be determined. And also, the other thing is it's a continuum. So is a scan subtle enough to pick up that continuum? Again, is unknown. Well, as far as I'm concerned, it's unknown. So it would be neurologists and neuroscientists that could answer that better than me. An interesting finding there from one of them, a guy called James Fallon, was that he used his and his family's brain scans as a sort of control for the brains that they were interested in, and he found his own brain was psychopathic. And he's written a book about it, which is quite interesting. Fallon, James. Yeah.
I've got a couple of questions from the online audience. I'm going to go with a really practical one, which I think is an excellent question, actually. If you have a family member who is one, how do you deal with them?
Well, again, that's
Any
really out
tips?
of my area, but I would say very carefully.
Okay.
And, yeah, it depends who they are in the family as well.
Okay. And there's another interesting one here, actually, about are there any positive aspects of psychopathy in relation to leadership? Anything positive?
Well, I would say no, but some other people might say there are. And the thing about them saying there are is psychologists look at the individual psychopath. So they ask themselves, you know, things like, will being tall and good looking help your career progression? And the answer is usually yes, it will, slightly. And so they ask themselves, will being psychopathic help you get to the top? And the answer is yes. So from that, they equate success with psychopathy, and journalists then pick that up, and you get silly headlines like, every business needs a psychopath. I'm going to show you, it doesn't. So it's more of an individual focus that they use, and I think you get slightly ungeneralizable results from that. Sorry.
Do psychopaths know they're psychopaths?
Sorry?
Do psychopaths, or do corporate psychopaths know they're psychopaths? Because there's an element of deliberate behaviour that I hear you're talking about, but do they have insight into the fact that they're psychopaths?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I've read studies that they tend to think, like we all do, we tend to think people are like us. So they tend to think everybody is ruthless and calculating and out to get each other, which we're not, usually. So that encourages them to take action against people who are not really a threat. They just think they're a threat. So it's a slightly different worldview than the rest of us have. Some of them, I think, realize that they've got this emotional void, and there are various theories that one of the reasons they want power and money and control is to fill that emotional void that they otherwise can't fill in their lives. So I suppose what I'm saying is that I don't really know, but it'd be interesting to find out.
Hello, can you hear me? Hello?
Yep.
Yep, okay, great. Hi, so I wanted to ask if you could elaborate a bit more about the rationality of a psychopath. How you say they're very logical and very very rational, but like, at least I'm thinking about it, surely it's not very rational to bully and to sink the corporate ship that you're sailing on. Surely if it does well, you do well. How do they rationalize and justify that kind of behavior then?
No, if they want to go on a trajectory that is at odds with corporate aims and objectives, then the only way you stop, well, one of the ways you stop people interfering with that trajectory is by scaring them. And therefore, they're not willing to engage with it. They're not willing to challenge your decisions because they know they'll be bullied and abused. So it's rational from that point of view. It's a means to an end. So their violence is usually not reactive. It's very calculated, deliberate violence, which aims to get them whatever it is they want to get. And that applies to both criminal and non-criminal psychopaths. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. Goodbye, Australia. And I'll see you at next year's Cambridge Festival, hopefully.